Hello, and welcome to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur, and I am a composer, and I am your host for this podcast. Today, I'm very excited. I have a guest who I have been familiar with for about 2 years because he had composed a score to a movie, Sintel. He had composed a secondary version of a score, his own version of a score to the film that had already been created. And he created a suite of that music, and I had the great opportunity to hear that suite performed by the Tualatin Valley Symphony here in the U.S. Let me go ahead and read you a little bit about my guest today. Matthew Beardsworth is a composer, orchestrator, arranger, and songwriter living on the North Shore of Auckland. Developing a passion for music from a young age, particularly cartoons and film music, he learned piano at age 4, violin at age 6, and started composing at age 10, wrote his first orchestral work at age 13. Going on to have new pieces and arrangements performed by leading New Zealand orchestras and overseas ensembles in Asia and the United States. Matthew plays piano, violin, viola, double and electric bass, guitars, ukulele, percussion, recorder, and harmonica. Welcome, Matthew Beardsworth, to the Melodology Podcast.
Thank you very much, Arthur. This is actually my first podcast, so I'm really excited to be here.
You are the third episode of the Melodology Podcast, and I'm really excited to have you here. I loved your music in the Sintel suite, and I've enjoyed engaging with you on social media and seeing your impressive work going on in New Zealand. And it's just been really exciting to see you just excelling in what you do.
Thank you very much. And it was an absolute honor to be able to have Sintel performed in the United States. Like, that is something super special, especially at my age. Well, I was 19, 20 when I wrote that.
Well, I was very happy to be able to help you get that performed, and it was a delight for the players to play. I remember the conductor enjoyed it very much as well, and it went over very well in the concert. From a very, very young age, you were affected by music, and like a lot of people, by film, and myself, I can agree, cartoon scores. Tell me a little bit about your experience growing up with music. What do you remember about music when you were very young? What excited you then?
Well, I remember one of the first presents I got for, I think, my first birthday was this little Casio toy keyboard. It had a whole bunch of presets. It had all the different instruments. I remember I played Ode to Joy on the preset button a lot, and that was a very distinctive melody, so that stuck with me. My parents also played Beethoven on the CD player to help me get to sleep, Mozart too. And so I remember the Mozart Symphony in G minor a lot. It kind of scared me a bit at that age because of the minor key. And then cartoons, yes, cartoons. Scales and arpeggios from the Aristocats was something I was obsessed with at age 3 and age 4. And that was, in fact, what inspired me to start playing the piano, because I wanted to do like the kittens.
Oh, how fun. Obviously, you're a film score fan. What are your favorite film scores?
Well, probably my favorite still is How to Train Your Dragon by John Powell, which is one of the strongest uses of melody in a film score, I think, of the last 10 to 20 years. I'm still a little bit disappointed that it didn't get the Oscar in 2010. Pretty much anything by John Williams, though Empire Strikes Back, I'd have to say, is my favorite out of his scores most consistently.
You have very good taste. That's my favorite. It's my favorite of his scores overall, I think, as well, as far as just the overall work. The Empire Strikes Back is just a brilliant score.
And I think comparing it with A New Hope, I think A New Hope is brilliant as well. It's kind of rougher, it's rawer. You can feel a lot of the influence from Holst and Stravinsky a lot stronger in it. Empire Strikes Back has become Star Wars through and through, a lot more definitely.
Right. Well, and the original Star Wars, George Lucas had a number of temp tracks for John Williams. And my understanding is John Williams did something different than he usually does, which is he listened to all of the different temp tracks and let himself be influenced by the temp tracks. And for anybody who's not familiar with film scores, what will happen when somebody's creating a movie before the music that's just for that movie has been written, a director will put other music down to fit on top of what's being seen on the screen so that he has an idea of the pacing and the energy that's created by having music at the same time as you're seeing the pictures. So that's called a temp track. And those temp tracks very often heavily influence the final score of a film. And there are a lot of films where you can see the main theme or a theme in a particular part of the film, and you can completely tell what other piece of music that came from. Famously in Star Wars, there's a lot of Holst, there's Stravinsky, there's, I believe, a piece that's supposed to be a Korngold piece that is referenced. So there's a lot of things that are very similar to other classical works, including also Rimsky-Korsakov, these big classical composers, these big composers that created huge works. Those pieces of music were used by George Lucas in putting temp music into Star Wars, because he wanted to ground the film with this, traditional sounding music that we would all be familiar with, but also have it be something that was big and operatic and dramatic. And John Williams he just ran with it, and it was amazing what he created. A lot of it is very much almost exactly mirroring the music that was the original source, but still, it's completely amazing, the score that he came up with. And I agree, Empire Strikes Back was Star Wars as Star Wars. It was very much its own thing through and through. The external influences are much harder to find as far as any specific. I don't believe there's anything that specifically is pulled in The Empire Strikes Back that's pulled from some other classic work. John Williams is just a completely amazing composer to begin with. He's been composing for decades. He created some of the most iconic scores in the 70s and ever since. And his style of composing makes for very memorable pieces, very memorable melodies, but he also uses tiny little motifs. So he'll just use 3 or 4 notes, and sometimes less than that. And that motif represents something in the movie. So for example, the Jaws theme, it's just a minor second. It's just, that's all it is. As soon as you hear that, you're in trouble in the water. And that's an example of a motif. And that's his style, is to use that kind of a tiny little motif in the music of a film, so he can very quickly get an impression across or get an emotion across that then tells the story and carries the story forward for the people watching it. And he can have a motif in the soundtrack that hugely changes what the audience experiences as they're watching it. And that's, he's an amazing talent. And in fact, we are today going to be talking about a melody by John Williams. Anything else on your background that you'd like to talk about before we go ahead and step into talking about this melody?
Well, I think something that probably bears mentioning is that I am on the autism spectrum. I'm autistic, and music for me has always been the clearest way of understanding emotions, that I know what to feel from, major key, minor key, whatever mode it is, combination of instruments. It just communicates to me on some deep subconscious level a lot better than words and body language does.
It's been very educational for me, again, because we follow each other on social media, seeing the things that you point to and the things that you mention as far as your experience. It's very eye-opening to me. To me, it makes us all richer to have people who do experience sound and vision and communication so differently.
Thank you, Arthur. I think it's funny that the autistic stereotype is, Sheldon Cooper, this almost Spock-like rigid order. And yet in my experience, there's a lot of intuitiveness going on there where I just follow my gut feeling, follow my heart. I could go on with autism for a whole but that'd be another podcast. This is music.
Well, I am hoping to have you on for another music podcast so we can cover some more about autism in the future, because frankly, The theme that we're going to be talking about is just one tiny little piece of a tremendous score. And even within the one piece of music that this melody comes from, there are probably 20 different melodies that we could look at, or 20 different parts that we could look at and have a podcast about. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a break, and we will come back and we will listen to and review our melody for this episode. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast. In this part, we're going to be looking at a famous melody by John Williams. This is one of the most inspiring and motivational melodies to me, and the piece that it comes from is just full of melodic and compositional techniques that are fascinating, and we could probably spend 10 episodes or more looking at those different things. We're going to be looking at just the main melody from The Raiders' March by John Williams. The Raiders' March is from his amazing score to the 1981 blockbuster film Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg. Matthew, tell me about your experience with this melody.
Well, I think the first time I would have heard it would have been the first time I watched Indiana Jones, obviously, not long after I got into Star Wars. And I've played it in the junior orchestra I was in as a kid in Auckland, and I've also been to see the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra play the whole Raiders of the Lost Ark score live to the film projected behind them.
Oh, fantastic.
In one of Auckland's main... Yeah, it's an amazing experience. So happy that they do those live to projection film score performances these days. It's super special.
Yeah, I have not had the chance to experience one of those. Unfortunately, the ones that I wanted to see were coming out right when the pandemic was going to happen. And so I missed my opportunity for the ones that I had planned on going to. But yeah, it's an amazing thing now that they have the technology to keep a live orchestra, keep the conductor keeping a live orchestra cued to the film, so you can enjoy watching a film with the sound and the resonance of a complete orchestra right in the same space as you. That's a really exciting thing. So this is one of the very motivic melodies that John Williams creates, and it has a lot of different elements that he uses a lot. We're just going to go ahead and walk through this melody as if we'd never seen it before, just looking at the various different elements in it first. So we're just going to kind of walk through and see what is there as far as motives and repeats, things that sequence, basically a few notes that happen in a different place, different rhythms that he uses, and so forth. Again, this is just the melody. This is just the main melody from the Raiders' March. And I'm going to start out with just the first four notes. That's it. What do you see just right away with those four starting notes?
Well, most obviously, it's an ascending, it's going up. You got steps, some little step, E, F, G, and then it jumps up to the C, and it's immediately established that the key is C major. And it ends on the tonic, which gives it this very definite sense of stability right from the outset.
Right. And before this is played, we're already sitting in four measures of this key of C. I don't know if the actual march is in C, what we're looking at is in C, but there's four measures of establishing that key in the first place. So the fact that you do end on C just in the first four notes, I agree, it makes it sound like this is a stable, strong, established story or melody or person, if this happens to be about a person, because many people think that this is Indiana Jones' theme, the main character from that movie and from the other Raiders or the other Indiana Jones films.
And that is my interpretation of it, that Indiana Jones is a reliable hero. Even though he's making things up as we go along, we can always count on him to save the day in the end. So the theme reflects him. He's really ever swayed by, evil or temptation. We could rely on him if we were in the films in the situation where we met him.
One of the things that I have to point out is he has the dotted rhythm on the first three notes. So it's that dotted rhythm is something that he uses a lot. It makes it sound kind of martial, sort of military-ish. It makes it sound regimented, but it also adds excitement, because if it was just da 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 da. It's not as exciting. It's not as dynamic, and it doesn't have as much motion to it, even though it's the same four notes. Adding that dotted rhythm changes the feeling of those three notes.
Yeah, it does. I remember reading somewhere or learning from theory classes that used to be associated with royalty, that dotted rhythm, particularly in Baroque and classical French music, I think it was.
The royalty were introduced by overtures or fanfares that had that kind of a dotted rhythm to it. So I'm going to play the first measure again, going all the way into the second part of that same little three-note motif that comes up again. We see that happening just a couple seconds. Exactly the same three-note motif, one step down. So it's in sequence, one step down. And the other thing I didn't point out about the first four notes is something that John Williams does a fair amount, but a lot of times classical music won't, and a lot of times people who are composing melodies don't think about this. The very first beat of that next measure where the melody really starts, because the three notes, da da da, it's kind of an introduction into the beginning of the melody. It's kind of a little bit before the melody really starts. But then on the first beat of that next measure, he has two notes within the first beat instead of just landing on a single note that lands right on the beat. And that's something John Williams does a lot of in a lot of different pieces of music. And he does it here. To me, it adds more excitement and also a little bit of something unexpected. So the first time it's four notes total, but the second time it's just that three-note upward melody.
And the notes that it uses in terms of the C major scale, if we're assuming that so far it's in C major, it's now D, E, F, which hints at it's not in the notes of the main chord. It kind of adds tension, but it comes after that definite, more stable phrase. So a lot of the time we talk about phrasing music as in a question, answer, call and response, but here it's more like answer and then the answer is questioned. Answer question, sort of.
I like the way that, it's solidity first and then questioning. That's a good way of looking at that. Yeah. I hadn't even thought of that. So I'm going to start again at the beginning because it's not very long, but it all ties together as you go forward through this melody. We've got another sequence of the three-note rise and a jump. Again, this is a sequence, but this time it's a repeat of the pattern of the first time we hear those notes, but again, taken up in a completely different place. Something I noticed when I was looking at this melody is it's constantly rising. Even though we've jumped down, the melody is continuing to go up and up and up, because technically, when you're dealing with a melody, you can't have it go in one direction forever. You end up getting so high that only dogs can hear it, or so low that it just can't be played. But you have upward motion here because you have, starting at E, we go up to G and then up to C, but then the next note after C is D, an octave down. But it's still rising. It's still moving up, and it hasn't jumped too far from the start, but it's rising up in that second repeat of those three notes. And then the next three notes after that is directly a scale up. So we have the second three-note pattern, and then the third three-note pattern is just going up the scale from there. So we had D, E, F, and now we go G, A, B.
It connects those two phrases, even though they're little separate chunks with a rest between them. It creates this sort of continuity.
Yeah, and it's this continuing upward scale. Upward motion in music tends to create energy and create excitement. And especially when it's in a major key, it tends to create this feeling of happiness and eagerness. Now, we're still in this key. We ended on the same note in both places. It's an octave up F. So we got D, E, F, but then we go G, A, B, F. And we get really high up compared to everything else we've been on so far. This is the highest note that we've reached in the melody. So we're getting some really solid excitement there. And we're still off of that home chord. We're still, we've moved away from the stability and we're still in this place where there's tension. Anything else to say about this so far where we are now?
I think from a harmonic perspective, even though we're talking about melody, what John Williams is very good at doing here is using the melody to outline the chords. And
yes.
from what you can see, it's gone from the notes in that particular chunk make up a G7 chord, the dominants, and the dominant will usually tend back towards the home chord.
Right.
So that very hinting towards a resolution.
For folks who may not be as familiar with music and chords, as music is playing along, you'll have the harmonies underneath the melody. We're dealing with specifically a melodic piece. And the melody, most of the time, there's a lot of music where this doesn't happen and that's its own experience. But most of the time, especially in stuff that is easy to sing, very hummable and stuff like that, what's happening is while you're sitting on a chord in a particular spot in the music, the notes tend to land on notes of that chord. The notes of the melody tend to stay within the chord. And also, when you're hearing a particular chord, it's easier for your ears to land on a note that's in those chords. So it just kind of naturally happens that if you're listening to a chord, the notes that are in that chord sound the most appealing and the most pleasing to your ear. And if you are someplace where you're not on one of those notes in a particular spot, the tension is to take you from the note that's not in the chord and slide you up or down to a note that is in the chord. So that can create tension as well as this tension that we're talking about where we are on the main chord of the piece. And then we're not on the main chord, we're on the chord called the dominant, which is as far away really as you can be while you're still in the key. It's as far away as you can be from home base. The most tension you can have is there. And you really want to go right back to home base when you hear that. So this is the last time I'm going to start at the beginning of the piece, but I'm going to go ahead and start again right at the beginning. And we're going to go all the way through the whole first phrase now. So now we have arrived back at again, we've got a 3-note pattern, but we have a 3-note pattern with the dot going into a 3-note pattern that's right starting on our home note. What are you seeing here?
Well, it's the same. That's the same note that that first little phrase ended on, that C. And given that the melody has gone pretty low down to that low D and high up to that high F, that C feels very much like the center line of the whole Raiders March melody.
Right. And looking back on the path that we've come so far, the lowest note that we've hit so far is the D. It's one step above our home note of C. So we haven't ever landed on the C down at the bottom of the scale. Music also has sort of an elasticity where it doesn't want to go up too far or go down too far. It tends to want to come back towards a middle. And when you go in either direction, it does create tension to want to bring you back into space or into the same space as the other notes. And we have this high F in the phrase before, but then we bring ourselves back to C, which is, of course, the main note. And it's kind of in the middle of the range that we've landed in so far. And of course, it's home. But John Williams doesn't stay there. He doesn't just go back to, he continues keeping you a little bit off of balance or off balance by going C, D, E, going 3 notes up, which is, again, it's a repeat of a 3-note pattern, which we've already had a whole bunch of 3-note upward patterns in this, but it's very solid. The thing I noticed there is it's beat, beat, beat instead of anything dotted or anything jumping. And it's three quarter notes, right on the beat of the measure. Particularly
military-esque there. Yep. Bum, bum, bum.
I'm going to go ahead and go forward from there. Looking at the music, and of course, we have video that goes with this podcast. The video is available on the Melodology Podcast Patreon page. So if you want to watch that, you can watch that as become a patron of our Patreon page. And we are looking at it, and we can see that we're back to a pattern that matches the very beginning. So I'm going to start playing the next notes, and we have a pattern that calls back to the very beginning of our melody. It's the same 4 notes. What's going on here? What's happened?
Well, the main difference is it's the same D, E, F notes at the end, but now it's up the octave. It's a continuous scale instead of jumping back down the octave.
Yeah, this fascinates me because it's the same notes almost. It's slightly different rhythm, but it's the same notes an octave apart as we have in the beginning. Here's the beginning. And think about just how different that sounds when it's exactly the same notes, but the last notes are played up an octave. It actually is exactly the same rhythm. So here we go. Even though it's exactly the same notes, it sounds completely different. And I've notated here in the music that we're looking at, when it gets to that high F, John Williams takes the music completely out of the scale that the piece is written in. And so where we're, in this one we're looking at, it's in C. He goes up to the flat 2 major chord. He goes up to D flat. And F it's a note in the C scale, but it's also a note in the D flat major chord. So his melody is still in our scale, but there's this emotion behind it, and there's this chord behind it that is completely outside of the scale.
And because it's got that connection of the F, it doesn't sound so jarring or foreign. It creates tension, it creates mystique, it creates the feelings that we would associate with an adventure suddenly gone haywire. You're getting chased by a giant boulder in a temple, but it's still home. It's still tied to C major, and it's still in a major chord. So it's still hopeful and adventurous, and all this is exciting.
And it's a surprise. That's one of the things about the film, is there's so many surprises in the film. And this chord right there, we've gotten again to that highest note of the melody. This chord is a surprise. It's, where did this come from? But it's joyous and exciting, as well as being, oh, wait, what happened?
And speaking of being the highest, which ties into the next phrase, because if whoever's got the video will probably be able to see that the melody starts to fall for the first time in the whole overarching contour of the Raiders' March. Right.
And again, what that means is we've built up all this tension, and with a piece of music to be satisfying, you get that tension, but you want to release that tension. You want to bring the listener back to a home base. You want to bring them back down to where it's comfortable. And the whole resolution of a piece of music is when that literal resolution happens from tension to consonance and back to being at a safe kind of home place. And so, Matthew, what you're mentioning here is now we get this, it's still got a dotted rhythm to it, but it goes downward, and it's completely different, really. Other than the rhythm, it's completely different than anything else we've heard. But I'll play it real quick, but then I want to point out how this kind of works. So this is the end of the first repeat of the main melody. It's very clearly, it's very high where it was before. It's not the highest note. The highest note's an F, but he's going down from F to E to D. And I think that G is literally just kind of a little rhythm to keep you pushing forward. But it's really, the notes here are that high F going down to E and D, and then just repeating that E and D over and over again. It's just the same 2 notes with that little rhythm in there, but it still comes across, just listening to the notes and not listening to anything else, it still comes across as very exciting.
It's constantly suggesting some sort of resolution, going for that dominant tonic sort of resolution, but it keeps on, it's kind of like a stuck record that it isn't an actual resolution.
Yeah, kind of like at the end of every, of the Beethoven symphonies, there's kind of the joke about the bomb, 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 like going back and forth from the dominant to the tonic to the dominant to the tonic. And this kind of plays with that a little bit. It teases resolving and then doesn't resolve, and then teases resolving and doesn't. It does that basically 4 times right there in the last 2 measures of the melody. And
you can, of course, tie that into Indiana Jones's adventures. He's constantly, you think this is going to be it. No, it's not. They still, bad guys still got the treasure. They still got the Ark, and
right, they still got Marion.
Still got Marion, but the whole plot just plays with you just like that until you finally come to the climax of the film, the resolution. Indy saves the day. But even then, they always have that ending, like the Ark goes into storage at Area 51, or also it's the sequel hook.
Yeah, setting it up so that the story's not over and there's intrigue, even though the heroes of the story have reached their happy ending, as it were. There's still that question of what comes next, and there's still mystery out there. And the reference to that huge warehouse at the end, which they also use in the 4th movie, this warehouse of all these mysteries that you just don't know what's going to be in them. It's stable, but it's also unstable. It leaves mystery behind. So this is the first time that section plays through. And it's very unstable there, but I want to point out, John Williams does different things in the middle of the piece to move on from this melody into different melodies. And there's an entirely different melody. There's a B melody that, according to John Williams and Steven Spielberg, John Williams came up with 2 melodies that he thought would be the main melody for the march, and he was suggesting either of them to Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg said, well, why not use both of them? So there's a B melody that's got similarities, but it's very different from the A melody. And that B melody, we're not even getting into that, but he jumps from this melody to that melody in different ways. So all we're going to be looking at today is this A melody, but I'm going to point out at the very end of the piece, you finally do get that resolution that you've been waiting for. We have that last upward scale of the main theme going all the way up to that F that's on that odd chord. He has then those repeating E and D notes, and then you finally get an actual resolution to the overall melody here. And this is the last time, right from that last little first repeat of the melody where it goes up instead of jumping down. Here is that all the way to the end of the way that the way this particular melody really does end. Finally, you end up landing the melody on the tonic. And even though you've had so much excitement, and that note at the end doesn't really last very long compared to the whole rest of the piece, but you finally get to have that resolution and that, reaching the end of the journey at the end of that melody.
All the way at the end, after all the adventures, of course. It's funny when you analyze it from this perspective, it's very easy to just superimpose the melodic contour onto Indiana Jones's adventures in the plot. But then you wonder, is this what was John Williams actively thinking of that when he was writing Raiders March, or was he simply following a more intuitive musical muse?
That's something about composing talent and about kind of every artistic talent. When you start out doing stuff, you have this combination of trying to do things and doing things intuitively. And more often than not, you start out and you're doing things either by imitation, or you are intuitively understanding how things work, and you're kind of going off of that intuitive thing. And there's, as you learn more and learn more about how this stuff works, for example, by looking at these melodies note by note, you start to understand the techniques that are going on there, and you get a toolbox of techniques that you can say, well, I need to have something that raises tension here. So you can grab a tool from the toolbox that is a raises tension tool. And I need to resolve the tension here. I need to have a little less tension here. You can go grab a tool out of the toolbox that reduces the tension. You can use those different things. Then once you've been doing this, I think for the length of time and with the amount of of volume that John Williams, like the sheer number of pieces of music that he has composed, I think you get to a certain point and it's just innate that you've got the tools. You don't necessarily think about pulling a tool out of the toolbox. You just grab it and use it without necessarily even thinking about it. This particular work, I do definitely want to have you back to talk about Marion's theme, which is the love theme from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it curiously has rising 3-note motifs, very much like this does. And I wonder, did John Williams do that intentionally? Was that something that he just did it and it was kind of a natural, intuitive thing for him to do that? Because you get the same kind of mirrored shapes, but in a much more lovely and romantic sound, representing the love and the emotion wrapped around the Marion character in the movie. So I think, in some cases, he's making specific decisions, and he's very, very careful about crafting his melodies. He even talks about how much time he spends going through agonizing over individual notes in his melodies. So I think a lot of time what he's doing is very, very conscious decision making, backed up by tremendous amounts of intuition.
Absolutely. And when you get to that level of experience, knowledge probably becomes a lot more intuitive.
Anything else you want to say about this particular melody, or anything along the way? Did we miss something that you thought of?
Something that I did have written down was that a common trope that John Williams does use is the perfect fifth as a perfect fifth interval to open up a hero's theme. Other composers use that trope as well. But here, it's a perfect fifth would be C to G or G to D, but here it's a perfect fourth, which it's the inverse of a perfect. It's a perfect fifth, but backwards.
There's no perfect fifth anywhere in this piece except going down. When we get to that place where we got the repeated E to D, it drops down to a G, but that's the only place in the whole melody where there's really a perfect fifth, notes that are placed a fifth apart. And that's very different from his other stuff. I remember when I first heard this music being used in the film, and I saw the film in the theater as a probably 12, 13-year-old. I guess I was 13. And I remember thinking that it was music that already existed. I thought it was a piece of music that came from World War II or something like that, because it sounded so familiar and sounded so like I'd heard it 100 times before I even saw the film. And this was not when you could hear a film score accidentally a bunch of times, or that it would necessarily be using the music over and over and over and over on commercials. I remember the first time I heard this music playing through the speakers in the film, I thought that I'd heard it before. I thought that it was already some piece of music that had existed forever, and they were using it in this movie just because it fit.
That's the power of John Williams, isn't it?
It is. It completely is. His ability to take musical notes and arrange them in a way that it sounds completely natural and like it's the perfect fit for something. All right. We're going to go ahead and take another break. And when we get back, we're going to find out more about Matthew Beardsworth. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast. I am Arthur Breur, your host, and I am here today with Matthew Beardsworth, who is a friend and composer from New Zealand. This is the time where we get to talk more about what's going on with you, things that you've done. Specifically, I know you brought an example of a melody that you created that after you created it, you changed your mind about it. First of all, tell us about the score that you composed to Sintel, the movie Sintel that was a Blender production. Tell us about your score that you created for it.
Right. So it was 2018. I was in university doing composition assignments, wanted to do my own thing as well. So I set myself the personal project of writing a new film score to an open source animated film, which was Sintel. And it took about 6 months. I composed entirely using Sibelius. I was manually calculating time codes for hit points and tempos to get those hit points. And I was writing straight to the fully orchestrated from the start, which is probably one of the reasons why it took 6 months from start to finish.
thinking in terms of writing out something for an entire orchestra, you've got to deal with every single instrument, where are you going to put each melody and so forth. Even John Williams, who we just were looking at the Raiders theme, even he did a reduced score with, I think, like 5 or 7 staves of music. And then he handed those to an orchestrator that he works with, or to an assistant that he would work with, who would break it out into what different parts were on different instruments. So that sounds like you gave yourself quite the challenge.
Quite a challenge. When I get inspiration, I can very clearly hear what I want in my head. So sometimes it's almost like transcribing on a good day. And on bad days, it's more like chipping away at a marble statue. You
had an idea in mind for what you thought the main melody in your Sintel score was going to be.
Yes, I knew it was going to be, because of the setting of Sintel as this very medieval, old-style adventure. I knew it had to evoke that sound, so it was tending towards Dorian mode, which has that, Celtic connotations. I was looking for a particular I knew what orchestral sound I was looking for, like it's inspired by some James Horner, inspired by How to Train Your Dragon, Lord of the Rings. It came down to finding the right melody. And the first melody I wrote didn't work out, but for the main character theme, but fortunately I was able to reuse it.
So I'm going to go ahead and play that first melody. And you thought this was going to be your main melody for the piece. Tell us about why that wasn't working for you.
As we were been talking about melody in this podcast, it does come down to contour, that I ended up finding it wasn't working as a main character theme because it was too static. It felt like it clung too close to the home note of B. It didn't really go anywhere. But that ended up lending itself well to a later scene in the movie where Sintel is going on a very long journey and it's sort of monotonous, although she's traversing fantastic landscapes that's only brushed upon briefly. It's a very long quest. And so this theme, with its kind of lent itself better to that, the monotony of traveling for so long.
So it did work out. You got to continue using that melody, even though you felt that it wasn't your main character melody. So what did you do then to create your main character melody?
Well, I started from scratch, and I started working off the common heroes trope where you have a perfect fifth at the start to create that sense of majesty and stuff. I started consciously from that point, and then sort of rolled intuitively from there.
Now, I noticed looking at this melody, again, you start out with an exciting upward step. The melody goes up, and then you have the resolution going downward. So again, you've got that contour of going up and going down. This is the final melody you came up with for your Sintel heroine. You do have that leap at the beginning, that identifiable leap. You only have so many different arrangements of notes. You only have so many different intervals that you can choose. It's funny how a perfect fifth from Star Wars, for example, the Star Wars theme, you don't hear it exactly the same notes as you do in your Sintel theme. It's a completely different experience, even though it's exactly the same interval.
It's a lesson for composers or something that I believe in, is that music should be like that. You can take a very similar melody and you can make it your own song, which is something that stifled my compositional ability earlier, like in 2017, 2018. I was worrying so much about being super original, and the anxiety, it did not make it easy for me to be creative. I can probably go a little bit in depth about Sintel again, about the melody. That the first scene that this melody appears in the film score is Sintel in the mountains, and there's a very clever association that, you know, it's a very mountainous contour of the melody. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, and you got all these little craggy bits of mini ups and downs all throughout. And another thing that I wasn't able to expand on in the film score, but I was able to build on in the concert suite, which the Tualatin Valley Symphony performed, is creating a B theme out of a little phrase I hinted at towards the end, this little mini resolution where it goes from B minor to the relative major D major, and then dips back down to B minor.
With the same thought in mind of, did John Williams do these things in his score intentionally? Did you intentionally make the Sintel melody craggy, or is it just in the instance that you used it at the beginning where it was more craggy than the regular theme?
For me, it just felt right. Was my main concern that this fitted a lot better. And in fact, a lot of the things about the contour were pointed out to me by David Dram, a composer who came to visit the University of Auckland in 2018, and I had the chance to take Sintel to him, and we sat down and we discussed it. And he talked about breaking the melody up into little bits and putting it back together and creating as many variations as he could.
It's always interesting going back, for example, looking at my own compositions and then examining them after they've been composed, because I don't know if you experience this, but very often when I'm composing, I'm very bad at documenting the process of how I got from point A to point B, how I got from the idea to how I got 16 measures of a piece of music that are basically done. That in between part where I'm taking the parts and rearranging them and moving them around and coming up with the thing, I usually go into a sort of a flow state, and my process is it just happens and happens in there, and I don't usually think about it. Then after the fact, when I go back and look at what I created, sometimes years later, I look at it and I think, look at that little thing that I did right there. That's really clever. Did I do that on purpose? I can't remember if it was something that was intentional or if it's something that just happened.
I think so much of my music, particularly when I write in a melodic style, is intuitive. I mean, I come back to it later and I spot these things like, oh, that's cool.
There are some things that I know I did intentionally that I think are pretty clever, but it's always the things that I don't realize or I don't remember that I did intentionally that are in there that are the fun surprises when somebody says, oh, hey, did you know that you did this in this piece of music?
A similar experience I had was at university. Once I was trying to notate how it feels to have, having a meltdown, having burnout. So in the middle of that state, I got a piece of score paper and I just scribbled down some random notes and some random directions. And then I come back to that now. I do not know what they translate to at all. But the experience of, in a calm state of mind, it's such a different state of mind for me that I look at this thing and I can't really tell what I was like.
So we have two cues that you've brought today. Tell us about this first cue.
No, they are the final orchestrated uses of both the original and the final Sintel theme. This recording was done virtually during the lockdown in 2018 by the Reddit Symphony Orchestra, which was a months-long project and people recording at home and submitting, and an editor who I'm very grateful for spending heaps of time stitching it all together into essentially an orchestral live recording.
Wow. So this is, again, Reddit Symphony Orchestra, a suite from Sintel. This is available on your SoundCloud, because we're looking at it right now. So this is still up there on SoundCloud for people to be able to listen to the entire suite. But we're starting right about 4 minutes and 50 seconds.
rendition of that theme. As I've said before, it's a fairly static theme. So the way I created interest there is a lot of it is in the backing and the choice of instruments. So the melody is pretty much constantly shifting. There's constantly instruments being added, instruments dropping out, and the harmonic backing it's got these little leitmotifs as da 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 da, and the snare drum and stuff happening.
Is there a particular part in the film that this music lines up with?
It's this is the traveling scene from when she goes on the adventure and all through different environments, the desert, the jungle, another desert, mountains.
And using that very first theme that you came up with that you didn't think was going to work as a hero theme, but you felt did work for the travel and journey that she goes on.
Oh, it did. And I was able to use those different instrumentations, the different timbres to represent these different environments. And I was also, changing the time signatures, trying to get the phrases to line up with the transitions between scenes. The string swell in the second half of the melody I timed with the camera panning from this night shot of a village to the day shot of the desert, the burning sun. The camera rises up over a sand dune. It's very evocative. And
then the second cue, this is the actual Sintel theme. This is the second theme that we listened to, and this is fairly close to the beginning of the overall suite. Orchestration-wise, one of the things I kept in mind was I wanted to make this a hero's theme, but at the same time not too bombastic, because in the terms of Sintel as a character and her character arc, it's a lot more personal. It's not big battles. It's very much her and her pet dragon in the film. Anybody who hasn't seen it, it's a 3D animated Blender production. I believe at the time they were just trying to show how really powerful the Blender software could be, because a lot of people were just thinking that it was a toy because it's open source for creating. It's a free software, but it is extremely powerful. And watching this movie, you can see that. But it's also a very touching and interesting story with surprises in it that you just don't see coming. So in terms of the orchestration, I wanted it to sound a bit mellow, this very plain, as well as being, adventurous and bold. And I think not to want to use gendered terms, but I didn't want it to sound masculine, but I didn't want it to sound overly feminine either. As much as I love Princess Leia's theme, Marion's theme, those definitely have that connotation of, romance to them. It doesn't really factor into the story at all. Spoilers. Well, Matthew, thank you very much for being here today. This has been a really fun episode. Of course, the Raiders March, who wouldn't love just examining that? But it's been a real pleasure having you here with me to do this and to learn more about you and about your work. Where can people find you online? My YouTube and my SoundCloud and my Instagram are under the name Matt Bear Music NZ. That's with Matt with 2 T's. And I think just look up my name, Matthew Beardsworth, on Google, and a bunch of stuff about me should come up. I will include links in the podcast description. My name is Arthur Breur. I am your host. The Melodology Podcast is at melodologypodcast.com, and all social media and SoundCloud and every place else, it is just Melody Podcast. Thank you for listening today. We look forward to coming back and sharing more amazing melodies with you in the future at the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers.